David DeGuzman inside the NBC4 Digital Center here with a very special guest, Mary Ormsby, longtime journalist for the Toronto Star, author of a new book called World's Fastest Man, The Incredible Life of Ben Johnson, and more importantly to our audience, a former Ohio State volleyball player. She was a 1980 All Big Ten selection, captain of the 1979 team that won a school record 37 wins, and also a member of the Canadian national team in 1981. And with that, Mary, thank you for joining us. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. And thank you so much for having me on.
Is that school record, by the way, still standing? I haven't looked.
Oh, probably not. It's like forever ago, right? So I hope it's been broken many times over.
I'm sure it was awesome to be part of, and we'll talk about your time at Ohio State down the road. But first, I want to get started with this new book that you have. It's been 36 years since sold 1988. Why did you want to revisit this topic of Ben Johnson, which, by the way, is kind of a bit of a polarizing topic in the track and field world, even to this day?
Yeah, well, I was around in 1988. I was in Seoul when that happened. And at the time, it was like an open and shut case, right? Ben tested positive and everything very quickly unraveled after he won the gold medal. And he compounded things by lying about taking steroids for a long time. So it was it was a very closed case, and we all kind of ignored it and moved on. But over the decades, I'd kept in touch with Ben and began asking a little bit more about Seoul, what happened at his hearing. And the more I heard, I thought, oh, I wonder if we'd actually, missed anything the first time around. So I went back and looked at some documents, and that's where I got the idea to, oh, I wonder if he was, deprived or denied of due process in his hearing, which is the crux of the book. And, I'd written about it at the Toronto Star, and then it turned into a book. Ben asked, do you think there's enough here for a book? And I went, yeah, I think so. We'll do this. So that's kind of how I kept in touch and began looking back at information that we probably as media should have challenged a lot harder back in 1988.
Let's go back to 1988. And full disclosure, I was not born yet. About two years away from that. Not to date ourselves or anything like that. But I think any fan of track and field or really of sports, they understand that that was a big pivotal moment in Olympic history. If you can take us back to what it was like at that time, and let's remember, no social media, barely if any, not even any internet really. But that was, a big event. The men's 100 is always, the showcase piece of any Olympics, but there was a lot of spectacle going into that one specifically. It was a star-studded field. What was it like to cover that event specifically with obviously Ben Johnson as the centerpiece of it?
Well, the lead up to it, and you were quite correct in describing it as a spectacle, because it really began in Rome in 1987 at the World Championships. And that's where Ben Johnson set a world record and beat Carl Lewis and the rest of the field quite handily. And a very bitter rivalry became more, more entrenched after that, because there were bad feelings and a little bit of trash talking back in the day, all leading up to Seoul. And at that point, too, Carl Lewis had obliquely referenced rumors of Ben using drugs and steroids, and that he was a bit of a cheater, and that he was cheating on his starts, because that was his big weapon. So a lot of bad feeling building up to Seoul. But when you're actually, in the stadium at the time, there's like 70,000 people, and there was a lot of, noise and shouting and applause before the race, but you could really, really just hear silence when they were lining up for that one race. And then it was a race for the ages. 4 men ran under 10 seconds. I think that was the first time ever in history. So Ben is able to run another world record and turn his head and taunt Carl Lewis at the same time. So for Canadians or people who were, fond of Ben, it was iconic and cheeky, and, Americans win everything, it seems, but the most glamorous race at the Olympics is the 100 meters, and the Canadian won it.
How did you find out that Ben Johnson had taken drugs?
Well, yeah, I got a phone call about 4:30 in the morning on the Tuesday in Seoul. My boss from home he phoned us and said, and there were no cell phones back then. He says, get out and find Ben Johnson. It's moved on the wire that he's failed his drug test. Go get him. So we're like, oh, shocked, and running out trying to find him, at the hotels, Olympic Village, the airport. But by then he was gone. He was on his way to New York and then on to Toronto. So that's how we found out. So it was like doubly shocking. Couldn't believe it.
Yeah, I mean, I can only imagine what it would be like today because it's, obviously we're so interconnected. I mean, I would assume if that happened today, it would come out in a tweet. You'd probably see a statement from the Canadian Olympic Committee or WADA, and, it would kind of go from there. And also, I would imagine at the time there weren't the handlers or the publicists, at least to that level that we see today. Things were definitely very different back then.
Oh yeah, no, it was there was paralysis on the side of the Canadian Olympic officials in Seoul. They didn't know what to do, how to answer anything. And at that point, Ben had left the country, so he was gone. So everybody remaining in Seoul was thinking, what do we do next? How do we deal with this? Including the Canadian officials who just really just seemed to not know what end was up. So it was it was kind of a hopeless time.
So the premise of the argument in now looking back at this case is that, as you said, this case might not be as cut and dry or black and white as it may have seen. When you were writing the book, and I know that you talked to a lot of different individuals within Ben Johnson's inner circle, what evidence, besides what you just described, points to an argument that says, he may not be as guilty as we would have thought?
Well, I'm not even sure it's as cut and dry as that.
Yeah.
What we're looking at the hearing, it's his right to have a fair hearing.
Right.
And that is quite separate from supporting someone's behavior, because
Fair enough.
Ben is not blameless in all this, right? He broke a rule. He later admitted it, and he lied about it. But the other part of the argument that we're sort of seizing on, this is what I'm trying to explore in the book, is it possible to railroad a guilty man? And at that hearing, first of all, he was excluded from his hearing. The Canadian officials thought, well, why don't you just go back to your hotel? We've got your back on this. And, very quickly, the Canadians didn't bother to look at his actual drug test, at none of the supporting documents. So they didn't look at that drug test at all. They just assumed the science was trustworthy, unassailable, and it may have been, but they didn't test it or challenge it. They just accepted it. The other part was a second test was used on Ben, an endocrine profiling test that was an unofficial Olympic test, but it also showed that Ben was or purported to show that Ben was a longtime steroid user, which back in the day was like, science fiction stuff. Man, you could tell someone has been using it for a long time. Wow, this was wild. But they hadn't disclosed that to the Canadians. So the Canadian officials defending Ben had no idea this was going to drop on them. They didn't have any chance to find an expert to challenge that. That endocrine profiling test to support the original test. And to make matters even a little more complicated, the impartiality of the hearing panel. The panel was made up of IOC Medical Commission members. These are the same people who did the testing, analyzed the testing, prosecuted, judge and jury, and they're the ones who recommended to the IOC Executive Committee, this guy should be disqualified, strip him of his medal and send him home. So that was not an impartial hearing panel. So all this to say,
right,
he had the right to a fair hearing, and I laid out in the book is that I don't think he did. He was deprived of due process, procedural fairness, whatever you want to call it. He didn't get a fair hearing.
So could an argument be made then, and I guess this is what you lay out in your book, right, that maybe Ben Johnson was kind of a scapegoat in that case?
I don't know if even that's the correct way to describe him, but I will say he was the only track and field athlete in all of the track and field athletes in Seoul at those Olympics to test positive. And that to me defies some sort of odds, but I can't take it any further than that. Was he a scapegoat? I don't know. Why did he test positive? I don't know. I know why he thinks he was sabotaged, but I mean, I don't go any further than that.
Mhm. Is there any takeaway from the book in regards to doping that we could apply to today's world? And obviously, you look at the history of doping in the Olympics, we're not far off from the whole scandal that involved the Russian Olympic Committee and the what I would say impressive operation that we saw from the Sochi Olympics laid out in the documentary Icarus on Netflix. What takeaways could we take from the book and from what you were able to discover and report on that we could apply to today's world?
I think Ben's case resonates today because we were talking about having faith in the system. So the anti-doping system exists to protect clean athletes and clean sport and fair play, all things which are wonderful. Uh, if Ben has issues with the integrity of the process he went through, that resonates today because how can you look at a system in 2024 that is supposed to be protecting clean athletes when you've got this whole crisis now with the supposed tainted test of the Chinese swimmers and the allegations that WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency, somehow covered it up 4 years ago so these Chinese swimmers could compete and win medals in the Tokyo Games. So going into Paris, and quite rightly, Travis Tygart of the U.S. anti-doping agency is just saying, this is a train wreck. We've got to wrestle with this somehow. Like this just cannot be. So athletes and the public have to have faith in a system that has integrity. And right now, there's no trust. Like, what kind of performances are we seeing out there? Who's clean and who's not? And it's so unfair to all the clean athletes out there, as it was in 1988 too, because there were lots of clean athletes out there, including sprinters.
Yeah, the topic obviously more relevant now than ever. And I think it's good to look at the past and kind of see what lessons can be learned if we've learned them at all, and see how we can apply it moving forward. You mentioned the Paris Olympics. Might want to delve into that a little bit. So are you covering that? Is that something that you'll
I am
be
not.
covering? Okay.
I am sorry, but I am not, but I will be watching.
I mean, I'll be watching too. So this is actually going to be my first as a fan that I'll be watching. From the Canadian perspective, how exciting is it to just be approaching Olympics where, you know, first off, it's a real Olympic. Not that the other two weren't real, but you know what
I
I mean.
know.
It's like non-COVID. We have fans
Yeah.
now. So from your perspective, how excited are you for the upcoming Paris Olympics?
Despite everything I just said,
Right. Yeah. That kind of conundrum there.
despite all that, I'm
Yeah.
totally glued to the television, the radio, the podcast, everything. I adore the Olympics and I will be watching. And actually, track and field is one of my favorite things to watch. There's just so much, and it's such a majestic, part of the Olympics. There's teamwork and there's individual work. So I don't care. I watch it all.
Yeah. You've spent decades with the Toronto Star. How many Olympics have you been able to cover?
Well, I ended up only covering three
Okay.
because I ended up having four children along the way too. So, all those mat leaves and everything. So it's kind of got in the way and I got busy, but, I had a great time. I was there in 84. It was my first one in Los Angeles and that was a wonderful event. I really loved that.
Well, times have definitely changed since then, but I feel like the premise of still covering an Olympics to its core, it's covering stories and storytelling. Um, for those who aspire to, one day cover an Olympics as a journalist, what lessons do you have from your experience?
One of my very early sports editors said, Never forget that sport is about people. You can throw the score in, and you can throw in, what round of the playoffs are in or however many gold medals they won. But it's always about, exactly as you said, the people, the journey, who surrounds them. And that is some of the most powerful stuff, whether they're on the podium or not. So I would say, whenever in doubt, if you're ever worried about, how do I get into this? Think of the people involved, what it took to get there and who supported them along the way or who didn't. There are a lot of stories in there where just incredible individual accomplishments, people coming from almost by themselves.
We're at an interesting time now in the Olympic movement. We just came off of two COVID Olympics. We've also had the Olympics take place in non-Western, non-democratic countries. So Paris is a very interesting time for the Olympic movement. I believe this is the first games that's taking place under the true Olympic 2020 agenda, and the kind of the premise of holding these games in areas where you don't have to build everything from scratch, trying to avoid wet elephants. I'm wondering again from your perspective, because you've covered the games over a long period of time and you've seen it kind of from afar. Why will these Olympics be very pivotal for the movement as a whole?
There's a lot of feeling that they've become so enormous uh, that no one can afford to run an Olympic Games by building from scratch. And you just mentioned there's some really interesting ways to do it, with existing structures or rebuilding a little bit here. So I think, well, I don't know what they do with Thomas Bach involved. Sometimes I just not sure what way they're going to turn, but I'm hoping there's a more sensible way to run an Olympic Games by this. You don't necessarily have to go smaller, but you can go smarter with, climate crisis in mind, how to get people there, how to reduce carbon footprints, and how to run a games that's not going to destroy a city for decades after. And we certainly have that example in Canada in 1976 when the Montreal Olympics built, I don't know what they were thinking, the Taj Mahals to themselves. And, we're still paying for it all these decades later. So I just hope they become smarter, more efficient, and with an eye to climate. That's so important right now. Maybe, I can't ever see them reducing because there's so much money involved, but that might be an idea too. Cut out some of the sports that a lot of the world don't, they just don't do. Like, I don't know about the equestrian events. I mean, is there a discussion to be held about equestrian events, yachting events? Do they still have modern pentathlon? I don't even know. Like, a lot of countries don't do those sports.
I've got to say, I think Canada should be very proud of its Olympic history. I think the games that Canada has hosted have been tremendous. I mean, even Montreal. Look, I know there's a lot of,
Oh yeah.
but I mean, Vancouver was great. I went to the Toronto 2015 Pan American Games, and I thought Toronto was a great host. And I know there's a lot of like, oh, should we spend the taxpayer money on hosting the games? Like, oh, I don't know, but
Yeah.
I will say that when Toronto hosts big events and when Canada hosts big events, it's been great.
Well, I'm glad.
Let's move now to your time as a Buckeye,
Oh,
all these years later. I'm sure you still have fond memories of being a Buckeye. What memories still stick out in your mind?
the biggest one is those were the greatest 4 years of my life at Ohio State. It was a phenomenal experience, and I couldn't believe how lucky I was to be at that university in that program. And I made friends for life. I still keep in touch with some of the, and I just honestly can't believe how fortunate I was. The schooling was great. I went to J school almost from day one. That's what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to be a journalist, and the program allowed me to pursue that. I had support everywhere, had support for the team, all our workouts. We were treated great. 1977, that's when I went down. I was 17. And we just thought, wow, I'm at the top of the mountain. And I still feel that way, even though, women's sport has come so far since then. But back then it was like just being on top of the world.
Yeah, what is your perspective on how college sports has changed since you were here at Ohio State? It's changed a lot for the good, and some for like the not so great. I'm kind of talking, NIL and
Yeah,
how a lot of money has been involved too. But it's come a long way, hasn't it?
it has for women's sports too. I always thought guy sports always had they were always well ahead of the game. And with, being paid for your image and all that, that's great if you're football, basketball. It doesn't really trickle right down to some of the other sports. Um, but the way women's volleyball has got it's incredible. You're, filling arenas and stadiums. And, I look at the team now and think I would never make the team today if I was a young person today. No, I wouldn't, because I've gone down. I think even Jim Stone was still there. I went down to a clinic to help out, and I was so amazed. The women were such great athletes and they were so good. And I remember thinking even back then, I never would have made this team now. So, and in general, for the Ohio State women's volleyball program, it's a continual program of excellence, not just athletically. They produce academic All-Americans. They have a high graduation rate of their players. And these women come out of school and are ready to get going on a career path. And that has not changed since the day I went to school. And I'm so proud to be part of a program like that, that puts a student athlete, in a real package, that your sport is a way to help you move on with your life as well.
Yeah. Do you still keep in touch with your teammates?
I do, one in particular, Karen Allsbrooks, who's Columbus born. Go Karen. And she was our superstar back in the day. She I think was the first All-American in the women's program. I believe that's the case. And Karen stayed and worked in Columbus at Ohio State for a long time. And she's just an awesome woman.
When was the last time you were back here?
Too long. It's been too long. It's been
Yeah,
over a
come back
decade.
sometime.
I'd love to come back. I would.
Maybe you can be the commencement speaker this time, because I heard this last one didn't do so well. So
Oh
I think
man.
you might be not as controversial.
Oh yes. Okay. I promise to be polite.
Oh man, I think the bar is kind of low. So after this past weekend, so I think you would pass with flying colors. So, Mary, is there anything else that I may have missed in our conversation?
No, nothing that I can think of. You've been super sweet, and I really appreciate this time, and thank you for taking interest in the book. And I just think it was a historic injustice that should be addressed when you're talking about the Ben Johnson case, and that's one of the reasons I wrote the book.
Yeah, super fascinating book again for our audience. The book is called World's Fastest Man, The Incredible Life of Ben Johnson. Super relevant topic as we go into the Paris Olympics. Mary, thank you for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, David. This is wonderful. Thank you so much.